It was about 3 years ago when some friends of ours invited us to come and see their daughter perform in a Red River High School production of the 1960s off-Broadway hit, The Fantastics. Now, it was fun to see this little girl that I'd held on the day of her birth and baptized later, now nearly grown up and sharing her gifts, performing on stage. You may know the musical, The Fantastics, and the best known song from that popular musical was the song Try to Remember. It's a sentimental little ballad known by many of us who consider ourselves to be some kind of Broadway divas. Perhaps you know that song. Try to remember the kind of September when grass was green and grain was yellow. But do you remember how that song ends? Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow. And it doesn't have just one follow. It goes on, follow, 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 follow. It's a song with a lot of follows. And sometimes I think, maybe if I had written that song, I would have stopped with just one follow. But apparently, the composers liked the word follow, and so they included a whole lot of them. Follow, 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 follow. Well, the Gospels also are not short on the word follow. Jesus was always calling people to follow. And a good portion of these stories end with these familiar words, and Jesus said, "Follow me." He said it to Simon Peter and Andrew while they were casting their nets into the sea. Follow. He said it to James and John while they were mending their nets. Follow. Matthew was sitting in a tax booth. Paralytics were sitting on their mats. Saul was sitting blinded on a dusty road. Follow, follow, follow. Throughout the gospel stories, when people encounter Jesus, they are invited not to think more about his teachings or to applaud his miracles or even to admire Jesus. No, throughout the Gospels, when people encounter Jesus, they are called to follow. But just what does it mean to follow Jesus? And where are we following him to? And what is it that we need to leave behind? In this morning's gospel reading from Mark chapter 1, Jesus says, "Follow me," to 4 fishermen who are out in the middle of their daily work. And those fishermen respond by immediately leaving their work and their family behind to follow Jesus. Their immediate response to Jesus can be inspiring for us, I think. We might wonder, you and I, what would that be like to be so compelled by Jesus, so taken with his message that you would take off, leaving everything and everyone you know behind to follow? But even more, I think that most of us find this a story that's hard to relate to. I mean, how do you just take off and leave everything behind to follow Jesus? Most of us would find it very difficult to leave work and family and friends to venture into an uncertain future, even if that's what you wanted to do. Is that what it means for us to follow? Is this the example that Jesus intends us to take up? Well, I doubt that the writer of the Gospel of Mark imagined people following Jesus in quite the same way as these first disciples. Mark, as you remember, is writing these words down some 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. And so obviously it's no longer possible for people to follow the flesh and blood Jesus of history as those first disciples had. Those first disciples had responded to God entering into our world in a very specific time and place in the incarnate Jesus. Even though our call, though, may not be just like theirs is, I think that in this gospel story, Mark's community and you and I are still given the call to follow Jesus. And while it's not identical to their call, I think there's certain markers in this story that tell us important things today about what it means to follow as well. Those first disciples were called to come immediately and to follow Jesus into specific places at a specific time. And I think that you and I can follow immediately as well. We don't have to wait until we have more faith or more time or more money or a better understanding of the Bible in order to follow Jesus. Jesus is calling us to follow right here, right now, just as we are. And like those first disciples, we're not called to follow Jesus just in general, whatever that means, but instead we're called to follow him into the very specific places of our lives. Following Jesus means examining the places we find ourselves and the relationships we participate in and asking, what does it mean to follow Jesus here, now? For some of you, it might mean asking, what does it mean to follow Jesus as a parent? And I think that sometimes we should stand up and cheer on Sundays or Wednesday nights in support of parents who are bringing their kids on Wednesdays and Sundays, week in and week out, and trying to share Jesus in a community of faith in the middle of a culture that does not support this. And what might it mean to be following Jesus in your marriage or in your place of work? Or what does it mean to follow Jesus when you're thinking about what to spend your money on or how much to save or how much to give? Or what does it mean to follow Jesus when you consider what it is that you do with your time? What does it mean to follow Jesus if you're no longer able to do as much as you used to do? Or when someone that you love is faced with a challenging illness or circumstance? All of these, I think, are specific places and circumstances in our lives that are included in Jesus' call to follow. Following Jesus isn't simply admiring his life or his teachings. Following Jesus is striving to live as Jesus lived. Following Jesus is trying to treat others with the love and regard that he did, including all manner of people, but especially those who are overlooked or put down by society. To follow Jesus is to be about living his values of inclusiveness and love and forgiveness and obedience to God's word and ways. On Wednesday afternoon at our Bible study this week, we were talking about following Jesus. And we talked about how following Jesus is putting God in the center of our lives and taking ourselves out of the center. It's not an easy thing to do. Will we fail in our attempts to follow? Yes, we will, and sometimes spectacularly so. And will we always be clear about what it means to follow? I don't think so. I think that sometimes it's not an easy thing at all to know what is the best way to serve God and love others in a particular circumstance. But in the following, in the striving, and even in the failing, God is present and blesses our lives with God's presence and with the purpose that flows from living our lives caught up in God's ways rather than simply our own agendas. Here's the thing I want to be clear about, though. When we talk about following Jesus and walking in God's ways, it's always as a response to God's overwhelming love for us. It's always in response to the God who has first loved us. And as Lutheran Christians, we insist on this. We insist on the truth that all of our striving to follow God, to walk in God's ways, is not done in order to somehow earn God's love or be deserving of it. No, rather, our our striving to follow Jesus is in order to journey ever more deeply into the love and new life that God pours out on this world in Jesus. Our following is to participate more and more fully in the new life that God gives. Jesus calls, follow. And I think that depending on where you're at and what's going on, that call can be heard in different ways. Following Jesus might be heard as good news of great joy. Maybe you are all too aware this morning that the life that you've been trying to create for yourself just isn't working. And you know the burden of it, and you know that you need a whole new direction, that you need to do some things in new ways. Jesus says, follow, follow, follow. And in those words is the promise of forgiveness and new life and new beginnings and new possibilities. Or maybe life is going pretty well for you. You feel pretty secure and happy. And so when Jesus calls us to follow, it's heard as a kind of challenge or an interruption. The call to follow, after all, might mean you need to live more intentionally in your serving and your loving and your giving. It might mean you need to let go of some things that you like holding on to in order to take hold of something new. And yet the promise of the gospel is that when God calls us to give up or to let go, it's in order to fill our lives with an abundance that only God can give. Follow, follow, follow. And I think sometimes that call to follow comes to us as a kind of epiphany that shakes us up a little bit. I read a story this week about a woman who was rolling her cart through the supermarket, kind of blindly tossing in one item after another in a hurried flurry of consumption. And at the checkout counter, she was impatient because the line was moving so slowly, and she kept eyeing the other lines to see if they were moving any faster. Maybe I relate to this story because I do that too. They weren't moving any faster. And so she peered around to the head of the line to see who on earth was holding it up like this. And it was then that she saw them, an old couple with a few items that had already been scanned, people as thin as wisps, conferring over her open purse, looking into it like it was a wishing well. And they were worried that they didn't have quite enough to make it, and so they were debating about what items to take out of their cart. And she wrote, "And there I stood, cart loaded to overflowing, and I thought, for God's sweet sake, what on earth am I doing with all this stuff, living so impatiently, so centered on myself, when others are so thin?" In epiphany moments like these, Jesus whispers again, follow, follow, follow. Follow me, Jesus says, because I'm going to make you fish for people. And I didn't used to like that image. Baits and hooks, that just didn't seem like the way to go. But in Jesus' day, people fished with nets. And following Jesus is about leaving behind the nets that tangle us up in ourselves and in lesser things in order to have our lives caught up in what God is doing in Jesus. And following Jesus is extending that net so that everyone knows that God's love and acceptance and abundance in Jesus is meant for their life too. I don't know what you're fishing for right now, what you're hoping to find. I don't know if it's working for you or not. But today, Jesus stands before us saying again, follow, follow, follow. Follow me right now, where you are, as you are, and to where I want you to be. Follow me into a world that needs to know that I am still with them and for them. Follow me, for I will give to you what the world cannot give. Follow. Amen.